Uh, so faculty and students at HBCUs, welcome to the 2021 National HBCU Blockchain webinar series. This year, this is the fourth of our 6 series. We are privileged to have had distinguished luminaries joining us, presenting their work, presenting what they do in the FinTech and the blockchain, as well as the cryptocurrency industries. Now at the bottom, there's a Q&A. If you have any questions and answers, which you can ask maybe perhaps after the first 25 minutes, but when you do ask your questions, please note down your role as a student or a faculty and your affiliation, that is, which university you belong to. That's very useful for us. So this particular event is organized as a fireside chat. So it's going to be informal. There's not going to be a PowerPoint deck because the topic itself lends to a good deal of interactive discussions. The topic for today is the disruption caused by FinTech, how it's impacting jobs, what's the role of universities, faculty in terms of the curriculum, what steps need to be taken for the curriculum in this very, very disruptive environment. So we are pleased to welcome Anup Nanra. Mr. Anup Nanra is a luminary in the field of blockchain. He's currently the global blockchain leader at Amazon Web Services, where he's responsible for strategy and execution with the business partners. Prior to that, Mr. Nanra was with Cisco as their global blockchain leader. He's also a co-creator of a sustainability initiative that impacts the underserved community. So even in that role, Anoop's been a leader. So welcome, Anoop. It's truly a privilege to have you in this particular fireside chat.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for having the conversation of what is the role and what is the impact, and how educators and education in general can really help deliver impacts across this space. So super excited and looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Anup, can you tell us a bit about your work at AWS and Cisco?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I'll start with a little bit of background of why and how I got into the blockchain space. So I got into the space in around late 2014, early 2015, and wanting to really understand, I was at Cisco at this time, really wanted to understand what is the role of networks, IP networks, communication systems, and infrastructure in the blockchain space, and really wanted to kind of understand if, and maybe potentially develop ways where because Cisco equipment powers 60% of the world's internet traffic, by definition, most of the world's blockchain traffic traverses across Cisco equipment. And so we wanted to really understand and explore whether or not there is a broader role for switching and routing equipment in this space. How do we help build more resilient networks? How do we build more fault tolerance into these systems? How do we drive more efficiencies in accountability and transparency by empowering and enabling the communications infrastructure to have a more critical role in the blockchain space. And that led us, that journey kind of led us and the team to really think big around, how do we actually take blockchain technology and actually embed it within the fabric of the internet itself? And so applications that we were thinking through, could we actually dramatically accelerate transaction finality times, which helps address some of the, larger issues around cryptocurrencies and just digital assets more broadly. Then also expanding to look at, what would a blockchain operating environment look like from a smart buildings perspective, from a mobility perspective. And then we got involved, and I helped found and I chaired the Trusted IoT Alliance, which was really looking at the intersection of blockchain and the Internet of Things, really trying to understand what does it mean to blockchain enable something that talks to the internet. And while there are a lot of really interesting energy and power and mobility use cases, interestingly enough, a lot of financial markets use cases, capital markets use cases emerged as well. Being able to have real-time visibility with efficacy and immutability to, equipment leasing and finance. Being able to have the transparency of the operation of a piece of heavy equipment. How might that impact future financing or refinancing or underwriting of that equipment? And so we did a lot of very interesting things. We ran 4 global design challenges where we looked at a lot of these very interesting use cases, certainly around smart mobility, smart buildings, smart construction, smart cities. And then we actually worked with a body of innovators and startups who partnered. They collaborated to actually address business problems that sponsors of these challenges were actually having. And as Cisco, we learned a lot, right? We learned a lot about what are the kinds of questions that a customer might ask for, what might they be looking for. We learned about what are the nuances around partnering in this landscape, right? What does that look like? What is the expectation that partners and customers have of Cisco? So we learned an awful lot across the board, and again, not just limited to what naturally comes to mind when people talk about IoT. Then AWS came calling and said, "Hey, we'd like to understand if there might be an interesting opportunity." And so I joined AWS roughly 14 months ago to really help build the blockchain partner business, where we work with ISVs, technology partners, global SIs, the system integrators, to help build and transform this place into this space into an industry, right? Where we're actually growing the total addressable market. I think all the players in this space will acknowledge that the TAM is large, but I don't know that we have enough evidence to prove just how big it's going to be. It's going to be big, but the question is how big, and with our partners, we want to help grow that. So as I look at this, there's a lot of very interesting projects underway. We're focused on blockchain and sustainability. Sustainability, not just in terms of renewables, but also, what is the impact of this on capital markets and real estate and the underwriting in the insurance business, right? So there's a follow-on effect that we're helping to build a narrative around with partners. And of course, working on, classical capital markets use cases. I think one of the very interesting themes that has emerged around interoperability of all of these digital assets. Well, what about interoperability of these digital assets with classical infrastructure? How do we bridge that gap so that your traditional, Fidelity or Charles Schwab stock investor can say, hey, you know what? Through my existing account, I want to go buy some crypto. How do I do that? Right. And so how do we build these kinds of solutions where we maintain efficacy and accountability and compliance? So I'll pause there because I have a habit of rambling on.
Oh, this is fascinating. Uh, about 6 months ago, out of curiosity, I went to the Lucid Motor, which is right there, and tried to look at. This is the first time they posted jobs,
Yeah.
and they had posted about 300 jobs before even doing any groundwork. And the jobs they posted looked so different compared to a typical auto manufacturing. I was absolutely uh, blown away by the total disruption that's happening even in the auto sector.
Yeah.
So from a fintech perspective, how do you see this compared to the traditional finance and now the fintech? Where is all this heading towards from a job perspective, skills perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I kind of grew up in the automotive and heavy industry space. My father was the track mechanic at Jaguar in the 60s. Um, and so what's interesting to see is that, and in working with some of the OEMs out there, a car is not just a car anymore. A car is a data center on wheels, right? A car generates, I believe, the last time I got this spec, around 15 gigabytes of data an hour. And so you've got a vast amount of data that's being generated. That data and telemetry from the vehicle is being streamed into machine learning algorithms, right? To better optimize build, to better optimize future iterations, better manage and in some cases preemptively help address potential issues. But the skills that are being kind of asked for and sought after are very much data centric skills, right? So being able to manage all of that streaming telemetry, being able to understand and build models, analytics models, machine learning models around engine performance, engine dynamics, performance of suspension, usage of HVAC in the vehicle, being able to correlate all of that with atmospheric data. And so definitely there is a shift in skill set beyond, and I wouldn't say replacing the manufacturing aspects, but the skill set and the needs of an OEM are growing dramatically. And that's just talking about the maintenance and operations of vehicles, right? There's also an emerging notion around subscription services. So we know, a number of OEMs are actually piloting and experimenting with subscription services. Some have commercial offerings. And to a degree, I think the role that blockchain can play there is as these vehicles go from and evolve from being just EV vehicles to now fully autonomous vehicles, you know, where where does the efficacy lie, right? How do we trust vehicle to vehicle communication? How do we allow and enable a vehicle to see 3 blocks around the corner? Why should a vehicle trust any of the data that it is being presented with, right? And how do we do this in a heterogeneous fashion where we have multiple OEMs who are selecting potentially completely different underlying distributed ledger or blockchain technologies to suit their needs? How do we allow them to actually communicate, right? Vehicle to vehicle communications is not limited to strictly within the brand. It's across brands. And so how do we enable this trust mechanism to further deliver resiliency and robustness around some of that infrastructure? So you're definitely going to see, I think, a significant shift in skills and talent. Um, and data security, machine learning, and definitely advanced security systems that leverage blockchain technology are going to be a key requirement. From a fintech perspective, I think that's where the real interesting business model innovation can be explored, because we know that subscription services are being top piloted and tested by a lot of these OEMs. One of the narratives that might play out in a couple of years' time is no one is actually buying personal vehicles anymore. Vehicles on demand. I mean, we have kind of human driven experiences around this today, right? And so we know that there are companies like Toyota that are building fleets of these vehicle pods that are going to be showcased in the Tokyo Olympics. And these pods are repurposable. They can be reconfigured. They can allow for transactional behavior to occur within these pods. So in the morning, a pod may be facilitated or configured for taxi service, yet in the evening, it might be configured to be a hawker stand, right? But the idea is that this is now a place of business that is self-running, self-operating. I think is a very novel and innovative concept, and is something that I think we're going to see more of. So we need more people building these kinds of solutions and these kinds of capabilities.
Fascinating. And yeah, I was just trying to visualize the spot example. In the financial sector, we have these old established, and finance is known for that old thing. And here comes FinTech,
Yeah.
which democratizes everything, which the liquidity is immense in this environment. The question is, how will they even cope up with these changes? And what do you see is happening with these established financial companies and various financial spaces, such as underwriting, maybe, or equities or insurance?
Yeah, I think so. So in the underwriting and the insurance space, I think that's where we're going to see some very interesting innovation. Obviously, we know blockchain as a mechanism of providing transparency, right? Transparency between counterparties. It helps eliminate counterparty risk. It helps unravel and unroll potentially, or at least accelerate the digital forensics, accounting forensics around suspicious transactions. So we have a very, I think, viable security mechanism there. But what I think is very interesting about the underwriting and the insurance space, if we look at the topic of sustainability, right, and we look at the recognition that Larry Fink published a year or two ago, that climate change is the number one risk to capital markets and investing. We are seeing the emergence of impact and ESG focused investors who are all data driven, all data centric. The more data you can feed them, the happier they are. One of the questions that always exists is, what is the level of efficacy? Right. And if you're in capital markets, if you're in banking, if you have an interest in insurance and underwriting, efficacy is paramount. And so and people know this. I mean, this is not anything new. But what is interesting to see is the underwriting and insurance requirements are now starting to get to a level of fidelity where real-time telemetry is required. Insurance and underwriters want to be able to see in near real time. I mean, there is some abstraction, there is some anonymization, of course, but the idea that a real-time risk score to a piece of infrastructure, a piece of kit, the manufacturer of an aircraft or a ship, and the underwriting that gets tied with that, and the pricing of which is adjusted, and the investment of which is adjusted based on the risk, creates very new opportunities. It also creates a massive amount of data that needs to be addressed. So I think the impact that I think simple use cases as underwriting the construction of a new building or a new ship or a new aircraft is going to change. I mean, it used to be a very manual paper-based process. It is to a degree still somewhat of a paper-based process, but now getting more and more digital. But as we're now starting to see the acknowledgement and acceptance, broader acceptance of blockchain technology, the idea that you can get high quality, enriched data that comes with efficacy tied to immutability and the transparency powered by blockchain is a new class of data that can actually be turned into a new class of assets, right? And leveraged for underwriting purposes. So I'll pause there for a sec.
For all of us in academia who are always in the mode of looking at the future, looking at the technologies, looking at what's going to disrupt, I think this is very informative and allows us to see things from a futuristic perspective. When it comes to FinTech and blockchain, if you were to advise universities in terms of the curriculum, universities would have this general education curriculum, typically 40 credits. Every student needs to take that. Then the school curriculum for a school of business, it would be a course in human resource management, finance, accounting, etc. How would you visualize a new curriculum that really meets the needs of tomorrow?
So I've done a lot of hiring in this space, right? And when we got started, back at Cisco, there really was no such thing as formal blockchain engineering training. I don't know that there are that many schools today that even offer that. And so it was very difficult to find talent, right? Because we had a lot of applicants who were self-identifying as blockchain engineers, largely self-taught and self-educated, which was great. But their traditional and formal education may not have anything to do with anything relating to blockchain. And so what we did was we dissected the roles that we were looking for and really trying to understand what actually makes up a good blockchain engineer, right? If we could invent the perfect blockchain engineer, what might that look like? And so what we were able to boil this down to is we needed individuals who truly understood the inner workings of databases, right? Not just how to write SQL and build business applications on databases, but really understood the concurrency issues, the locking issues, the how to make functions atomic and acidic, right, from a database landscape perspective. So having very deep understanding of how the internal engines of a database work were absolutely critical. And then we said, well, we also need someone who understands real-time distributed communications, right? And that's a practice, that's a specialty, that is a formal track of education that goes back, more than 30 years, right? I myself am trained as a classical real-time distributed systems engineer. So we need those kinds of folks that understand how to get two or more elements or devices or resources or applications on a network to communicate when they have thousands of miles between them. The next question, the next requirement that we said, we need folks who really understand security, right? And not just simply how to, make a website secure, right? But really understand, how does encryption work? How does homomorphic encryption work? How do we actually establish new key sharing models? What is PKI infrastructure? How do we combine these different skills to build an engineer? Now, from a business development perspective, a completely different skill set. There we needed folks who truly understand the inner workings of how not just a company operates, but how companies establish relationships between each other, right? Blockchain is a space all about connectivity and collaboration and data transparency between multiple parties. How do we, we need from a business development perspective, the ability to understand these workflows, financial workflows, operational workflows, IoT workflows, map these to the requirements that are going to be built out and asked for from a technical perspective. So we need to understand how to basically manage data integrity, data efficacy, process integrity, which means having deep understanding of the actual business process. What is the FinTech process? What does the settlement process look like? What does clearing and settlement look like in detail? What are the technologies used to facilitate today clearing and settlement, and what might the future look like for clearing and settlement? What are the market impacts, right? So we have buy and sell side in clearing and settlement. What are their motivations? Why would they want to get involved in the blockchain space? We have a market dynamic that, certainly in clearing and settlement and the rush to T0 from T3, but the market structure doesn't really support T plus 0, right? Because we have a buy side that likes to operate the float and make money on the float. So what is their incentive, right? So it's about as much technical innovation as it is business model and market evolution. And these are the kinds of skills that we looked for when we were building our team.
You mentioned game theory. You mentioned new paradigms of databases, connectivity.
Yep.
Then from a business perspective, organizational connectivity, intra-communications, intra-enterprise communications. So if, I'm just thinking, if I was to design this curriculum, this broad curriculum for every single student, the general education, we typically, students are required to take one course in digital literacy. Mm-hmm. Right now, many universities are also going in for one required class in coding. Not all universities, some are requiring that all students must have one class in coding. So by hearing all of this, the question is, universities, should they be doing more hands-on work with these technologies? Because now we are looking at going into a deeper dive.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I absolutely. I understand what you're saying, and so, what my ideal candidate, new grad candidate, would have is project-based experience where you're actually bringing a minimal viable ecosystem together, right? From a hybrid perspective, understand a little bit about the business process and the connectivity, the relationships that exist, understand and implement the technology that might enable these counterparties, these partners, if you will, to actually interact and conduct business with transparency, integrity as an underpinning. And so, what I'd like to see in a new grad is that experience in projects where you are bringing together a coalition of the willing and building solutions, whether it's technology innovation or business model innovation, that address what that minimum viable ecosystem is asking for, looking for. And you might find that, and I think there are ways to really simulate this, right? You have students take on personas. I'm going to be a banker. I'm going to be an investor. Someone is going to be an auditor. Someone is going to be a customer who is asking for financing, right? So, a very simple, I think, exercise that would be interesting to conduct would be, how do you simulate a syndicated lending experience where you have different stakeholders, they each have their own requirements, not just from a business and industry commitment perspective, but maybe even internal corporate covenants. And how do you establish a very simple application that says a customer is going to come in and ask for $1 billion in credit, and that person has to express an existing and good relationship with their current financial institution. The financial institution may turn around and say, okay, we have a good relationship. We understand each other. We will facilitate the creation of this working capital. That anchor tenant, or that anchor institution, may then say, okay, I'm going to go syndicate this working capital across my portfolio of partners, where I'm going to put 5% in and the others are going to put in and make up the rest of the 100%, and turn that around in a couple of days as working capital back to the end customer, the client. I think from a technology perspective, I think the opportunity there is, how do you do that in near real time? So as soon as someone, as from a user experience perspective, if that customer goes to his bank's website, fills out a form, fills out his details, hits submit, the responding page is, congratulations, you have now secured your working capital, or sorry, these are the actions that you need to take to get access to this working capital. How do we build that? How do we build programs around use cases like that, where we showcase not only a business need and industry transformation, but also technology that can come with it?
Yeah, so there'll be so many new business cases, and I think what you described was a structured structured capital in real time.
Yeah.
And the real time makes it so different compared to the traditional ways of leveraging or acquiring working capital. And blockchain certainly does facilitate that.
It can, and that's not to say that there aren't checks and balances, there aren't give and gets that are part of that process, but those can be made, those can be codified, they can be made programmatic, and therefore you can automate those functions, right? So I think there's a very interesting role there in, how do you model these business functions, and how do you establish and identify the right level of governance and controls that these codified business processes must adhere to, right? And that is governance around smart contracts, right? So leveraging smart contracts to be able to drive automation, improve velocity of money, improve access to liquidity, right? Get working capital actually working faster, right? I think there's a great opportunity there.
We have amongst the attendees a chair of the sociology, a former chair of the sociology department. So from a social perspective, where do you see blockchain and from an educational, let's say from a curriculum perspective?
So I think from a social perspective, I think we really need to understand what is the impact on a transactional relationship where the act of production and consumption is a single transaction, right? So the notion that, today well, not today, in the near future, hopefully in the near future, when we have two organizations who are conducting business amongst each other, there's an accounts payable function and there's an accounts receivable function. Today, these processes, even though they are more and more digital, still a fragmented experience. There is still a reconciliation process that occurs, maybe nightly, maybe weekly, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly, right? We are seeing, you know, this notion of blockchain and the fact that production and consumption is a single transaction would result in, the accounting APAR process between two companies become a single real-time transaction. So when something is actually delivered, right? Let's say, product A needs to ship to company B. As soon as that product arrives at the receiving dock of company B issues payment, right? How do we do that in a completely automated way? And I think that's where, it's a significant shift in behavior, right? To have the expectation, not only from on both buy and sell side, that settlement of transactions occurs as soon as something is delivered. I think that will create entirely new incentive models on how businesses conduct themselves with each other. I think that will create behavioral change in a lot of the institutions. Clearly, the race from T3 to T0 is causing behavioral change, right? I would argue that, we have T3 today because of behavior that is ingrained and developed over the last 60 years of capital markets and working capital and what have you. By making that a real-time transaction, a T0 transaction, what kind of behavioral changes are we going to see? I think time will tell, but it's absolutely something that we need to expect, and I would say push for.
Thanks. And I had a question. Before we go to the Q&A questions, I would want you to talk a bit about AWS and what's AWS doing for universities. I know there's a program of AWS specifically for universities. If you can shed some light on that.
I'm not, to be honest, I'm not too well connected into that program. But as we look at the blockchain space, I do believe that there is a need to raise not only skill set, but the broader awareness of blockchain in general with universities. I mean, clearly, a lot of universities are now introducing, some aspects of blockchain into their curriculum, maybe a course here or a course there. But in my mind, that's probably not enough. I mean, and not all the courses need to be technology oriented. I think there is an opportunity to work with companies like AWS to help build programs around business model innovation leveraging distributed ledger technologies, leveraging socioeconomic programs, and definitely economics programs around blockchain technology. So it's not just limited to technology and learning how to code a database or build a database or learning how to secure an application or infrastructure. I think that's a part of it. But definitely, I would like to see more economics programs, more behavioral sciences programs that that expand on the notion that real-time settlement of any transaction will create monumental shifts in ways and in the way that companies operate and how they interact with each other, and the new business models. 2 years ago, if you'd have told me that NFTs would have been a thing, I would have brushed it off. I think NFTs are absolutely going through their fad moment, similar to ICOs. But what we learned out of the ICOs was critical. It was critical learning, and I feel that we'll have the same level of learnings in the NFT space, where I think today we really don't know what are all the questions that we need to be asking. But until we build it and try it, I think and experiment, it'll be difficult to uncover what those questions need to be.
Yeah, let's talk about these again, skill sets. One question that's been asked is, uh, how do you see the future of programs that are interdisciplinary, such as, let's say, an MBA with computer science?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe an undergrad, and typically these are handled at a 4+1 level, accelerated, which is a computer science undergrad and 1 year to complete the MBA. That's one model that's being followed, but universities tend to be very siloed,
Mm-hmm.
and it's difficult to push for programs that are truly transdisciplinary.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that in my own experimentation, in working with industry groups and customers and partners, that is something that I am developing an opinion on, and so far the opinion is, uh, yes, we acknowledge that there is technology and business model innovation that go hand in hand with this fledgling, nascent industry. But what are the mechanisms that allow us to come up with ideas, develop those ideas so that they can become sound business practices? So one of the things that I'm currently engaged in, with a partner and a few customers, is the notion of how do you actually integrate a digital innovation workflow into your practice, right? How do you, and again, leveraging, the mechanism, the AWS mechanism of how do we work backwards? We're famous for starting a project or talking about a project by issuing the press release, the PRFAQ, right? What does success look like, right? What are all the questions that all the different stakeholders might need answered? But fundamentally, what does success look like, and how do we work backwards from there? And so by leveraging our digital innovation framework, what we're able to discover is we're able to have a much richer, much more meaningful conversation across the different stakeholders. It is difficult to bring multiple stakeholders to the table. There are sometimes competitive sensitivities. There are sometimes co-opetition sensitivities. But in general, where you can align different functions within those organizations, a digital innovation mechanism is really helpful, not only in fine-tuning what the problems actually are, right, from a business perspective, but then also coming up with very quickly, what does the working prototype look like, right? And how do we accelerate that timeline so that we embrace a model of prototype fast, be action biased, learn, fail, learn from those failures, and reiterate, right? Always improving, always progressing the idea, the concept, the solution. And I think as a hybrid expertise or a hybrid class of training, understanding the technology, understanding the business process, but then also empathizing with the ecosystem, I think is a critical aspect to innovation, right? We see a lot of technical innovation for the sake of technology. We see a lot of business model innovation for finding means of driving revenues or improving the bottom line. But it's when you combine the tech with the business process, with empathizing with customers, that's when I think true value starts to emerge. So, as a hybrid program, I mean, that would be one of my expectations out of a hybrid program is how do we identify very quickly value that we can hone over time using these various tools. So I'll pause there. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, and as universities, we do struggle with the silo mentality, which is again very typical of large organizations.
Yeah.
And universities need to become more nimble. It's as you were saying, it's really not an easy task, but we need to be cognizant that it may even become a question of if we aren't nimble enough, some of our programs will just perish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do see the question in the chat there from Judith, and I think there is a requirement developing from employers around not only understanding the insights of business, but as I mentioned, also empathizing with the customer ecosystem and those that you are trying to influence, but then also being able to quickly learn from experimentation. And to do that, you have to build things. You have to put things in people's hands and in front of their faces, and in order for you to learn. And so being able to accelerate that cycle, I think, is going to be pretty important.
I also heard you mention about digital innovation. Mm-hmm. So just based on this, if my university or one of our partner HBCU university introduces a BS in digital innovation, takes courses from a few from computer science, few from business, economics, absolutely, etc. Do you think there's a value to that?
I think so, but I would also be a little bit careful, right? Digital innovation is not broadly leveraged yet. At AWS, I mean, we use it prodigiously because that is the mechanism by which we actually innovate and meet customer requirements and deliver delightful experiences. But a lot of companies are still trying to develop an understanding of what digital innovation actually means for them, right? But more importantly, also how to deliver or measure the ROI on a digital innovation program. In certain areas, it's clear because you can run an experiment, you can measure your results. There might be an impact, an improvement to revenues. There might be an improvement to profitability. There might be the ability to access a new market that you didn't have access to before. You might have new channel partners as a result of the innovation that you're coming up with. So, it means different things to different people. And I think as a curriculum, I think it would be very interesting to really explore one, what is, and not going too deeply, but what is the breadth of the opportunity that can be unlocked through digital innovation, but then very quickly focus in on a number of key projects that, and working with potential employers, potential sponsors, right, on real business problems, right? And how do you leverage a digital innovation mechanism to facilitate conversation, discovery, prototyping, testing, feedback collection, and really push the boundaries.
It's very interesting you mentioned this need for having real business projects. And
Yeah.
we find that constantly from our potential employer base of our students, that this is probably one of the most important things they're looking for. And from a student learning perspective, I think working on a real project does certainly give them that particular experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to caveat that when I talk about real projects, it's projects where there's a sound business case behind the project, right? That there is an expectation on revenues, profitability, improving on baseline revenues and whatnot, or trying to figure out how to access new channels to market, how to access new markets, right? In the space, we have, in the blockchain space, we have seen a lot of experimentation. We've seen a lot of pilots and prototypes. We are only just now starting to see some of those projects get turned into production opportunities, right? But I do believe that we are starting to see an acceleration of graduation from pilot and POC to production. It might be small scale production, but it's still production. I think we have a long ways to go before any financial institution puts 20% of assets under management on a blockchain network, right? But that day will come, right? So we're starting to see some improvements there. But I think that's where we will definitely be paying very close attention, right? It's the real business problems. It's the problems with actual business cases that underpin them, where we believe we have efficacy in the data, in the business case, that we have a high degree of confidence that this engagement, this project, will actually turn into a production deployment. And I think that's where that will help. As universities develop curriculum around this, I think that will help build confidence with potential employers as well.
Yes, there has to be some payback to the employer also.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's critical. Yes.
Yeah.
There's one question, and this pertains to, I'm familiar with the AWS program and the educational initiative, but that's the overarching cloud computing side.
Yeah.
Now, on the blockchain space, do you envision developing curriculum for university partners?
It hasn't come to mind, but now that you mention, I think that would be very interesting. I think that would be very interesting to really help shape what some of these programs might look like. So that as an employer, and not just limited to blockchain, but this new model of trust and decentralization, right? Which to a degree leverages what we commonly now know as being blockchain, but there are other classes of technologies similar that can deliver similar results, albeit through different mechanisms. But fundamentally, they're all focused on how do you deliver efficacy, how do you deliver data integrity, process integrity, right? So being able to create curriculum around this, I think would be very interesting. It'd be fascinating. I'd love to have that conversation.
Great, and I can envision that to be perhaps 4-hour modules, as an example, on very specific disciplines, topics, and universities may be able to leverage those by incorporating those models in their curriculum. So again, that's a sort of a disruption that is taking place in academia.
Interesting.
How to leverage existing modules created by others into their own courses. ensuring some level of validity to the outcomes, to the assessments. That is, if there's a certificate that's given out, then that certificate becomes the credential.
Yeah.
That becomes the validity aspect for an instructor.
Yeah, I think the notion of derivative works, I think is for educational material is interesting. And as a blockchain use case, you can maintain attribution and credit and whatnot.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that would be an interesting use case for sure.
Yes. So definitely we can get back in touch with you about this and start a dialogue to help our HBCU partner institutions to leverage AWS resources, your leadership, your thoughts of AWS in the blockchain space from a curriculum perspective. And even that gives us a very good insight into how employers are seeing what's most important to them.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating conversation to have, and I think the timing of it is more important now than ever, especially as more and more enterprises are beginning to adopt, digital assets for more than just business process. So yeah, I think we're going to see a huge boon in creativity and solution development, business modeling, business innovation. So definitely looking forward to that.
Great, thank you, Anup. We are short of time. There's so much more to discuss, but time is limited. So this would conclude this particular session. We have 2 more sessions in our webinar series. And I will go over a few of those. So on Tuesday, April 27th is with CTO of PayPal, Mr. Edwin Elke. On Thursday, April 29th, it's with Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett from Virgin Islands. I will urge all the attendees to come to those. Thank you, Anup, for this fascinating, very thoughtful, I would say a very visionary view of what universities should be doing to meet the future needs of society. Thank you for all the faculty and students who are attending this. Now, and special thanks to those who've worked behind the scenes. Judith Schnittman, Tanisha Walters, Ali Amdad. Ali could not be here today. Without all of these FinTech folks, it becomes very difficult to hold any of these events. So thank you for everybody who's been working behind the scenes. We would also like to thank Ripple Corporation for supporting our activities and for Morgan State University for allowing us to host this webinar series and the general support. The recording for this session will be available on our website. So please go to fintech.morgan.edu and get the recording for this particular thing. There were so many interesting things that Anup spoke about today. I think it's good for us to go back, refresh what was spoken about to help us with our curriculum and see how we can prepare students for the future. So thank you again, Anup. This was an amazing discussion. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks for having me. Thank you.
This concludes today's session. See you all on April 27th then.
Thank you. Bye-bye.